Cafe CLIL 14, Redefining CLIL, on the 17th of November 2010, 5 to 6 p.m. Central European Time.
Right, well, welcome. We're on Cafe CLIL 14, and we're going to redefine CLIL today. So we've got a huge
tour.
And I sent out a kind of bullet point list of points that we might discuss, and I'll just read them to refresh your memories, and then we can pick up on whatever's interesting. And I mean, in the first place, what is CLIL? And I got an interesting email from somebody today saying, why would you want to redefine it? And I think that really says it all. My response to that email was, because there are so many interpretations coming out today in the blogs and the lists and the literature, that it's a good idea for us to try and recap and say what we think it incorporates. How important is culture in CLIL methodology? And we had a very interesting and evenly balanced discussion in the Fact World group recently about the role and place of culture in CLIL. And related to redefining CLIL, number 3, what are the main key dimensions of a CLIL methodology? And then number 4, if we could mention maybe some resources that have come out in the last few years since the CLIL debate in Cardiff that was 2 years ago in the IATEFL conference, because there has been quite a lot of literature within that period, and it might be useful for us to pick up on it and have a bit of a to and fro with our reactions to that literature. Would anybody like to jump in and make a start, or shall I do that? I'm quite happy for somebody to take the reins and have a go. Yeah. Yes, I was at ICER, and it was, I mean, the first thing I have to say, it was an excellent conference. It was a conference, and it's actually been described to me by other people as the CLIL conference. Yeah. And although that sounds a little bit of a cliche, I think it's true. It's actually the biggest and most significant meeting of teachers and professionals working in CLIL who actually give themselves that title. So that's the first thing I would say about it. But the other thing I would say about it is, I think that the definition of CLIL is becoming more diverse as we have these conferences. Yeah. And I'm not sure whether that's a good or a bad thing, or whether it's a healthy thing. But that was certainly an impression I got, that there were certainly more than 3 dimensions to CLIL. There were many, many dimensions to it at that conference, even though everybody there, I think, did have a CLIL hat on. Oh. I met a lot of colleagues who have a very clear understanding of what they're all about when they call themselves CLIL practitioners. Yeah. And the most impressive for me was a colleague from Asturias who was presenting about a project in his school where the English department works alongside the content teachers departments, and they produce language lessons in order to support what's going on in the subject lessons which are taught in English. Yeah. I can't remember the name of the guy, but I'll make a reference to it in our minutes anyway, so that people can go along and have a look at their school website. Egbert, what's your feeling about the situation of CLIL as we understand it in Kassel in Germany?
I think the more we talk about CLIL in these projects and on websites and from One Stop CLIL, the more diverse it will be, because there are traditions in language departments of countries and also national conditions, so that they will try to stand for their idea and to accept a new idea. An international perspective will be a problem for them.
Yeah. So you're suggesting that actually CLIL is an organic movement that
Yeah.
grows as we practice and develops from the practice.
Yes.
I would agree with that.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's just that, I mean, there are so many different contexts. It's happening all over the world in different points of view and people with different objectives and different facilities and resources. It's bound to be hugely varied. There's not much we can do about it, except every time we have a conversation, we just got to establish what we mean by it. Otherwise, we tend to talk past each other, you know.
Well, one thing I would say is it feels to me that the last 2 years since the ITEFL debate in Cardiff, we do have now at least a clear differentiation of ELT CLIL and the content teachers CLIL, which it did feel a little bit overlapping and a bit muddy before that event, and since I think those two camps, while they're still related, they've become more defined, more clearly defined.
Yeah, it's a useful distinction, and it's a fundamental distinction as well in CLIL, and we need to sustain it.
I agree with that. I also think, as you mentioned in the review of that paper which you posted on the Cafe CLIL website, CLIL has become everything to everyone. I think the common denominator is still the C and the L, the content and the language. And that's why I still like to go along with Peter Mahisto's term. CLIL comes in so many different varieties and shades, and depending on the local culture, you can't really say there is a defining or unified CLIL methodology. It's done in so many different ways that probably the only thing we can agree on is there has to be content and there has to be a language, and we have to start from the content side and then look at the language that is needed in order to support the pupils cope with the content. That would be my definition of what CLIL is. And as you said, it's organic, it's ever-changing, and we've got to go along with it.
But what about the qualification of those content teachers teaching their content in English? In Germany, we have a clear direction to only accept certified English language teachers in the most cases, and we do not like content teachers just using English as a working language.
Even if they're good at it, you mean?
Yeah, probably. The way is the headmaster and the people from the language department like to test them if they are good enough in their perspective to use English as a language. Mm-hmm. And as they are not English teachers, there's also a lack in their profession teaching English, teaching content in English.
Mm.
Yeah, I think
that certainly restricts your choice of teachers a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. This question of qualification is an important one, isn't it, in Germany? Because as Egbert said in previous discussions, the recognition, even the permission for a school to call itself a bilingual school comes from the qualification of its teachers, and that has a huge amount of weight, not least in when parents decide where to send their kids. So even though, I mean, Egbert, I know, is not qualified in terms of the English language, yet I know from observation he's very qualified in terms of practice to teach his subject in English. And yet, in terms of the official recognition, he's not qualified, and that's a problem in Germany.
Mm. Well, I do agree that qualification is important. The situation here in Switzerland is it's a sort of a two-pronged approach. At the moment, CLIL is done in grammar schools, and that's where the content teachers who've got a very high language competence are used. However, the other side is, at the moment, the drive for CLIL comes from the English language teaching side. And there are usually language teachers who gang up and come up with local projects in order to teach their subject, usually at primary, sometimes lower secondary as well, to teach their subject, to teach English, and using materials and content from other subjects. Now, if
are they qualified in those subjects?
They are, usually they are qualified in those subjects, but there's still a tendency to look at the language first and then choose the content, and not vice versa.
I was going to say something about that brings us back to our debate on a clear definition, because I actually think that a lot of the grammar schools in Switzerland, and I'm making a sweeping generalization, Peach, when I say this, that a lot of what goes on is really total immersion in a lot of grammar schools in Switzerland, where the subject teachers can switch into the foreign language, and the kids can cope with that switch in a foreign language. But I wouldn't call it CLIL, because I think for me the definition of CLIL is identifying language needs of students and then making decisions about what to do to provide support for those language needs. And that's what defines and determines CLIL for me.
Yes, may I jump in?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, I participated too in the conference in Eichstätt, and I got the impression there that there was a clear division between people thinking like you, as you said, and people speaking of CLIL as immersion, meaning speaking of CLIL, but in the perspective of an immersion language education. And I think this is now the time, to separate the two concepts. This would help teacher a lot, because CLIL is something different from immersion. It's different. Its philosophy is different. The context where it was developed is different. And I think that to insist, at least now, to insist with the use of the concept that CLIL is an umbrella term, it's not, it's not correct any longer. Not correct for the teachers, not for, people like ourselves, for example, involved in debates and theories and so on. Teacher needs something that help them to understand what is the difference between CLIL and bilingual education, I would say, in general terms. I and Francesca, and I'm sorry, Francesca, would have liked to participate in this Café CLIL, but she has a baby and she got a problem at the last minutes. We wrote an article, very, we are aware that it is a provocation, and the title of this article is CLIL, Suits for All Seasons. We got the impression that too frequently CLIL is used not only as an umbrella, but also as a suit for all seasons. That is to say, when you don't know where to put content and language, you use the concept of CLIL. And we think it's not fair toward CLIL, because CLIL is such a rich and fruitful idea and approach and methodology, and also opportunities for learners, that it's a pity to confuse people with the idea that it is a suit for all seasons. Sorry for this long speech, but
no, don't apologize. In fact, Loretta, I think your statement in the last 2 minutes has been very, very eloquent and clear. And I just want to recap, because something you've said I'm going to quote, if that's okay with you. And
yes.
you said to insist that CLIL is an umbrella term is not correct anymore.
No.
And I agree entirely. I think actually what we need and what our colleagues need are clear instructions and step-by-step procedures which help them work in a CLIL method in their classrooms. And it's a shame Phil's not here because he's quite outspoken on this issue. But I don't know what we can do because he's not in the address list. So let's bash on with what we feel are these aspects of this CLIL approach. I mean, I suggested, in agreement with Peach, that it's the C and the L, really, that are the foundation for me. Knowing what the content is in the curriculum, and that means talking to the chemistry teacher or the biology teacher about what they want to achieve, and looking at the demands that their subjects place on a certain group of learners based on their language level, what content they've had before, and what concepts they've come across before. For me, that's what CLIL is.
Can I quickly come back to this notion that you disagree that total immersion is not CLIL? I wouldn't go that far. I would say as long as somebody teaches a subject, his subject, that he's qualified to teach in a foreign language, be it English, be it French or German or whatever, and does not disregard the language side, which sort of is determined by the content that the teacher wants to teach. As long as that happens, total immersion would be CLIL for me. However, if a teacher does not look at the language side, he teaches his subject or her subject in English instead of through English, then of course that is not CLIL for me, because then the L side of CLIL is missing.
Yes,
at grammar schools in Switzerland, we've got two types of teachers. We've got teachers who traditionally sort of trained in a language, got training in a language, and usually in a subject like history or social science. And these are the ones that can incorporate the C and the L at the same time in their teaching. On the other hand, we've got teachers who traditionally come from the science or maths side, and they are not qualified to teach a foreign language. And they very often turn around and say, I can't do that. I can teach in English, but not through English. And they would need support by a trained language teacher, in my point of view.
I think
yes,
the thing about... Go on.
Sorry. Yes, I agree, of course. I mean, that immersion can be CLIL, but it's not automatically CLIL. This is what I meant. Yes, I agree.
I think you would. I think if you did pursue that really rather strictly, though, I think you would exclude quite a lot of what goes on in Europe, and especially in Northern Europe, because I suspect that in quite a lot of classrooms in Northern Europe, especially in Scandinavia, I think an awful lot of teaching, which goes under the name of CLIL, is simply teachers teaching their subject in English and not considering it their business at the same time to teach language. They assume that inexplicitly the language will be developed, which I'm sure it will be. But I think a lot of what is called CLIL is taught by teachers who are fluent, pretty fluent in English, and who simply teach their subject in the language and don't teach the language itself in any way explicitly.
Yeah.
Peach.
Go ahead.
Peach, could I ask please, what is the difference between teaching in English and teaching through English?
Well, when you teach through English, you look at the language side. You determine what content you want to teach, and then you think about the language that pupils need in order to cope with that content.
Yeah.
Receptively and productively. And then you look at that language, and you also you think about ways how to help your pupils with the language. Teaching in English, according to David Marsh, is simply teaching your subject using English, but you do not look at the language side of the matter.
That would mean if we had a series of specific tools, we could give science teachers to teach in a better way through English, because they didn't learn that as they are just science teachers. So helping structures, giving classroom phrases, giving specific phrases to argue and to work with the text, probably.
Yeah, definitely. I know that of a couple of grammar schools here in the Lucerne area who are using content teachers, especially maths and chemistry teachers, but they work alongside language teachers so that they don't neglect the language side of it. On one hand, to improve their own language competence in English, and on the other hand, to make them aware of the fact that they can't just rabble on in English, they have to support the pupils in dealing with the language of the content.
In a way, the feeling that's grown in myself about CLIL, and speaking as a secondary teacher myself and someone who works occasionally with primary teachers, I think of CLIL being taking what's been learned within the ESP and the EAP, English for specific purposes and English for academic purposes at tertiary level, and taking that into secondary and primary school at a conceptually appropriate level as well, of course, but it's about understanding the language of the curriculum subjects and making provisions for that for the learners of those subjects, which is what ESP and EAP have been about. And I picked up a couple of books I'm going to throw in the names of from Grenoble University recently that it's a shame they are only aimed at tertiary level science and technology, but it's a whole series of the grammar of science and technology, speaking skills for science and technology students through the medium of English. And the people who've written these books, and I'll make a reference to it in the minutes as well so people can go and have a look at the university sample pages from these resources, have sat down and they've thought to themselves, what do our students need in order to function in science or in technology? And then they've written a curriculum for grammar and a curriculum for lexis and skills for listening and speaking based on that initial analysis. For me, that's what CLIL is in secondary and primary.
Yeah, definitely.
Listen, would you be happy for us to look at the second point in the bullet point list? Because I think it is very relevant to this discussion. The role of culture in CLIL. Because it'd be very interesting for us to pick up on the Yahoo group debate that went on quite recently, where there was a seesawing of opinions about culture. And we've got references to literature as well on the Fact World website, from Uncovering CLIL, Mahisto, Frigold and Marsh, and the CLIL book, Coyle, Hood and Marsh, in 2010 from Cambridge University Press. So I wondered what you thought about the role of culture in a CLIL methodology. That's okay.
Well, before I leave, just a small comment from...
go ahead, Egbert. Yes, if you have to go, please do say something.
From biology and genetic engineering, I see a huge importance for the culture dimension. If you look at PGD in Britain and PID in Germany, the British expression means pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and we in Germany avoid the term genetic in this context. We say pre-implantation diagnosis. So in the running debate on PGD in Germany, it's clear that we have a special cultural accent on this debate.
Did you say pre-implantation genetic
diagnosis? If you talk to German people, you have to use PID, pre-implantation diagnosis, and British people use PGD as their own expression. So it's not only language, but it's culture behind, as we in Germany, on the history of Nazi regime and their selection of people, try to avoid the term of genetic diagnosis.
Yeah.
Interesting.
There was
You can't get away from it. I don't think you can possibly get away from culture in CLIL.
Yeah.
So there's no way you can do that. I think I think probably we would all agree on that. And some subjects force you to focus more on culture than others, like history does, for example. But obviously science does, from what Egbert was saying. I think one problem with that discussion was that there was a suggestion now and then that if you were teaching a subject in a second language, it was your duty to insert a bit of culture into each lesson. And I think a lot of us disagreed with that was not a useful way of doing CLIL.
So you'd have it as an extra richer dimension, perhaps, to a CLIL approach.
Yes, where it emerges and where it becomes important, as in Egbert's example, you have to deal with it. But I don't think you need to go around thinking there are 4 C's and we've got to get all those 4 C's into each lesson, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, Coyle, Hood and Marsh actually say that CLIL should be embedded in a cultural agenda, and that's where I totally disagree. I think that CLIL is always embedded in a cultural context, and that context is determined by, first of all, sort of school culture where teaching is happening, and then the sort of educational context within which schools operate in a country or so, and that is quite different, but it's not part of content which should be or should determine what is going on in CLIL, or yeah. I don't know whether you understand what I want to say. Meaning the content and the language or communication side plus the cognition side are the 3 important C's for me. The 4th C, culture, yes, okay, but this is not something which should be pushed.
Yeah.
Culture can be part of content, for example, at primary or secondary level when you talk about food and festivals, or when you teach, let's say, in history, you talk about the gunpowder plot or so. Then it can become, or culture can become part of content, but it's not automatically something which has to be taken into account when you plan and when you teach your subject.
Yeah. There was a wonderful quotation from the FactWorld Yahoo group discussion on this issue very recently, and I'm going to read it. It's on the homepage of the FactWorld website. Ridiculous. Everybody knows a language is the expression of a culture itself, so it is absolutely impossible to detach language from culture. And I think within my understanding and interpretation of CLIL and what CLIL methodology is, I go very much against the feeling and message within this quotation. I think you actually have to detach the language from the culture. And if anything, I would say the kind of North Atlantic, UK, American culture of the English language is not always appropriate anyway. And Egbert's talked about this before in these discussions, that culture itself has to be detached from a given target culture. To that extent, I can understand teachers and support teachers investigating perspectives on language within their subjects. But I don't think a dimension of CLIL that is a pillar of culture that lends itself to teachers having to think about creating a cultural dimension to their physics lesson on forces actually really helps the physics teacher. It creates extra work for them.
Yes, I have to leave now. Have a good discussion forward, and I'm looking forward to reading and listening to what we will see on Fact World.
Thank you very much, Egbert. It's great for you to join us. Thanks very much.
Bye, Egbert.
Hi.
Loretta, you wanted to
Yes.
pick up. Please go ahead.
Yes, I participated in the debate in the Fact World group, and actually I think that, I mean, language and cultures are something connected, that you can't separate it. I disagree with you. I think that it is necessary to be aware of the possibility that culture is an important dimension of CLIL. You have not to, I mean, to bring it to an extreme. I mean, if you are doing a math lesson, 1 and 1 is 2, of course, you cannot plan to investigate the cultural dimension of CLIL. But a CLIL teacher has to be aware when it is necessary, I mean, to add this cultural dimension. I think it is because it could lead to a reduction of the relevance of the native culture of the students and of the teacher himself, of course, if he is not a native speaker of the language, of a CLIL language.
And
I don't know if I was clear or not.
So. I think so. And in fact, your use of the term awareness actually gives the culture a descriptor, doesn't it? That it's about cultural awareness. And I think that's something that teachers can take on board, isn't it? And investigate their curriculum area for opportunities. And I think in a way that does help us clarify our definition somewhat, because when we talk about methodology, we are talking about building blocks. And I think what you're talking about, awareness, is less of a building block than a sensitivity to culture.
Exactly. But this means that you know both cultures. I mean, the culture underlying the language and the culture of the learner very well. It is a very high competence.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that teachers have to be aware of culture. Where I disagree is I personally think you cannot teach culture. Culture is there, and you've got to you've got to see in what context, in what cultural context language is used. But I personally don't think that you can teach that. It's something which you have to experience and take on board by immersing yourself in a certain cultural context. And the second thing which I think is problematic is as soon as you talk about the English culture, there's a big question mark. What is the English culture? I personally think there is nothing such as the English culture.
Yeah. Is it worth us drawing a distinction between classrooms where learners are studying the subject through English as another language, where the classroom is made up of many cultures and many languages? That's one group. And then the other group is what I think of as CLIL, and those European contexts where the classroom is a monoculture and the children are all from the same cultural and linguistic background. I think in the first context, and most of the literature I've found which pays reference to dealing with culture, is actually within the first group that I'm describing. It's where there are so many cultures in the classroom, it is an issue for the teacher to deal with the home cultures of the learners within the subject classroom in another language. Whereas in the CLIL classroom, I don't think it's as much of an issue.
I think that's one way of looking at it, Keith, but I think another way would be, even if you have a monolingual class and monocultural class, you're bound at some points to be dealing with culturally very live issues, you know what I mean? Especially in the humanities, especially in history. And I think that would be another reason for for highlighting the cultural dimension a bit more.
I agree, but I would say that dimension is part of the subject methodology. It's about good geography practice or good history practice for children to be sensitive to interpretations of terminology, for example. And in the Yahoo Group's debate recently, I think Kristallnacht was used as an example, and how different languages translate that term, and how that's passed across to children in the classroom. But I think that's a historical competence as much as it is a cultural competence, in a way that would not be the same in a maths classroom, because they don't have Kristallnacht in the maths curriculum, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yes, I think so, yes.
I mean, I think what I want to express is that you can describe certain competencies that appear in geography and history that are the same as skills that are taught in an intercultural approach to language learning. But that doesn't mean that the geography is following the intercultural approach to language learning. It's following a geography methodology. And I think that's the same for CLIL. I think CLIL in geography that has learners look at, mapping and boundaries in Europe from different cultural perspectives is a geography skill rather than describing it as a cultural skill.
But culture must be a history skill, true, and history teachers have to deal with culture. But they have to deal with it double if they're teaching history through a second language, and suddenly they're looking at a particular piece of history through, for example, French, when they might, if they'd used their native language, looked at it from the point of view of English. Suddenly that cultural element becomes a lot more alive.
Well, it's often one of the reasons why I see content teachers encouraged to do CLIL in their subject, because it's a period of history that's relevant to the English language in their country. But I wouldn't, and I've never felt that it's a foundation for CLIL. It's an aspect of teaching their subject in their home culture. And, that might be the Norman invasion of England linked to France in French history, for example. It may make sense for either country to use the other language partially within the content curriculum. But it doesn't necessarily define CLIL for me. It's part of the subject. Any other comments on culture? Because we had so much, and it's all noted in the Factwell page for our discussion today.
Yes, I think so. It depends also from the subject, as John mentioned. Because, of course, if you are teaching science, natural science, or math, there is an international, agreement about what word means and what the semantic content of word is. But when you go to subjects like history or social science or law, there are some concepts that do not exist in another language. For example, there are the concept of republic in Italy or in Greek has a different content of concepts respect as compared to the content that it has in other languages. And also, other words do not exist actually in other languages. And does it make sense? To deprive a lesson from this part of content if the teacher is not aware of this?
I think I agree with you actually, Lauretta, and it's one of my lackings. One of the parts of my character that actually I think I'm lacking in is I go round about the houses trying to express what I'm trying to say very ineloquently, and in the end I am agreeing with your thoughts that you express very well. But I think the point I wanted to make about this issue is what you've just said is applicable to any subject in any language. And I think what I'm trying to express is when a subject is taught in a CLIL method in another language, it's the content and the language that determine the methodology, and that the culture is an added extra as opposed to a stable of that foundation, of that definition of the methodology.
That's what I think. That's what I think as well. I would agree with Lauretta. Where culture comes in is the sort of the context in which a whole curriculum is decided on, and the topics, the choice of topics in a subject like history, for example, or do teachers teach the French Revolution or the American Revolution or the Russian Revolution? Depending on the syllabus which they're confronted with, they have to do one or the other. And I think that's where comes into the whole game, where in different contexts, different topics are chosen.
Yes, I think that the idea of defining culture as a dimension is just to invite people to reflect on it, because it is very easy to forget it.
Yeah.
I think this is my fear. It's not just because you have to push it even when it is not necessary, but the idea of putting it there as a dimension is, a kind of invitation to people who is training teachers or students at university level, to invite them to reflect on it. Because I met teacher, native speaker, who went in a classroom and forgot that they were teaching to people of a different culture. And you have to have the sensitivity and the awareness of this.
Yeah.
And I think it's part of CLIL in that perspective. Yes.
I think actually you're right, Loretta. Culture is all about perspective, isn't it? And intercultural awareness is about sensitivity to those perspectives, your own perspective on your own culture, your perspective on another culture, the other culture's perspective on your culture, their own perspective on their own culture, and intercultural communicative methodology is about incorporating all those perspectives into a methodology for teaching language. And I'm playing devil's advocate because I'm all for it, and I think the Science Across the World project, which I'm throwing in with a heavy heart because the website's closed down, is the best resource I've seen for putting intercultural communication into practice in the content classroom in any language. And it's all about those perspectives and what you do with them in the classroom, getting learners to actually look at how their home society looks at their home culture, and then put that alongside their partner culture, or partner cultures if they're communicating with several other countries. Do you mind if we look at another point on the agenda? I see we've got about 10-11 minutes left, and I really would like to ask you if you've got resources that you've come across over the last 2 years that you'd like to highlight here now, because we've got a public forum to do that, which you would say are or are not representative of a good CLIL approach. Did any of you come up with something you'd like to show?
Do you mean teaching materials or any kind of materials?
Well, the way I worded it in the prompts bullet points was, since the Cardiff debate, what's come out in the literature that we might discuss here as being exemplary or representative of our perspective, our interpretation of a CLIL approach. And I gave a list of a few, just as a prompt, of course, including the Uncovering CLIL book for teachers, the CLIL from CUP, again for teachers, my own vocabulary books I threw in there as well, as a carrot to dangle for some constructive criticism. And then there's a series from OUP, which is called the Oxford Content and Language Support, that's come out recently. The TKT CLIL course for teachers as well, that's come out since. Anything really that you would hold up as a shining light or a rag you'd like to throw away in our CLIL debate.
Well,
I just sent you a couple of articles, Keith. I don't know if it's possible to, I mean, to share, because I got them from the Journal of Bilingual Education. I found the article of Lauren Gayot, Linguistic Knowledge and Subject Knowledge, How Does Bilingualism Contribute to Subject Development? Very, very interesting. And I think this could help teachers a lot in reflecting. I sent it to you. And
I see that there. Listen, I'll write up the biography.
And just have a look and
yes.
Yeah.
And if it's, in terms of copyright, if it's possible for me to upload them, I will. But otherwise, I'll at least put in the biography reference so that colleagues can go and have a look themselves. Go ahead, you were going to say something, yeah.
Yeah, as a teacher trainer, I found the TKT course book quite helpful because it focuses on fundamentals, on basic concepts within CLIL. I also found the 2009 book, CLIL Evidence from Research in Europe, very helpful because there's not a lot of research being done and published and made available to people. So I like that book quite a lot, although I haven't read all the articles.
What's the reference to that book, Beach?
It's called SLA, CLIL Evidence from Research in Europe, 2009, yes. And it's edited by Yolanda Ruiz de Serote and Rosa Maria Jimenez.
Okay.
It's on Keith's list of materials.
Yes.
Okay. I'll put it in the minutes as well.
Yeah, and as a teacher, I really like your I like your series of vocabulary books. They're really helpful.
That's very kind, thank you. Somebody asked me recently, when are you going to do a maths vocabulary book? And maybe we can put that in at the end of our discussion, because Macmillan have said, hold on, slow down, let's see what happens. But I think it will come. The series from Grenoble I mentioned earlier about tertiary science and technology it's a small publisher, it's an institution-based publisher that's producing a resource that meets its own needs. And I think actually that's one of the problems we, as people who work with CLIL teachers all over the world, we would like a major publisher to produce something that is suitable for more than just one country's needs. And I think that's still to come. I think even with the Oxford Content and Language Support for Geography and Science, one of the issues there for me is the spread of weight over all the skills. There's a focus on text and a focus on grammar, and I'm asking questions about listening and speaking in the science and geography classroom there. And I think we're still waiting to see, the defining course book, whatever subject it is, that's offered for CLIL classrooms. And let's face it, IGCSE is growing, IB is growing. It's about time they invested some money in classroom resources that go beyond a kind of neutral culture from native speaker textbooks repackaged and sold for non-native speaker markets.
Can I just say something about methodology, Keith?
Go ahead, John.
We were trying to define CLIL context earlier on. There was a question about, whether you have a very wide definition, like anything that works where you do subject in a second language, foreign language, could be called CLIL, or whether it has to be, Peach was putting the point of view that there really, in order to fit a definition, there really has to be some explicit focus on language as well. Well, in terms of methodology, I mean, if you had a teacher who was pretty fluent in, if a subject teacher who was pretty fluent in English, for example, and was teaching to kids who were fluent enough in English, and used no methodology at all which related particularly to language, but nevertheless taught the subject very well, would that not count as CLIL? I mean, I'm thinking of a teacher that I saw in Italy, walks into the classroom, kids about 16, he's teaching I don't know, something in physics, something terribly complicated, put a huge visual on the board and proceeded just to talk the kids through it. And then he walked out, after an hour.
It's almost like a native speaker lesson.
Yeah, but it was extremely good. It was hugely clear. Now, is that not CLIL? Because it's not methodologically somehow language orientated.
I don't think it is. I think CLIL, by definition, is about dealing with language. And in fact, that teacher is probably teaching in a very similar way to any native speaker would teach their class without thinking about language. And you might call it total immersion because it actually mirrors what goes on in a native speaker context. And in fact, a lot of native speakers do teach in the total immersion world as experts, don't they? But
I bet a lot of CLIL in the Nordic countries is a bit like that. Good methodology, good historians, scientists doing good history methodology, good science methodology, but not actually relating much to language. And nevertheless, the kids learn a lot of history and a lot of science.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I don't have any question with the success and the methodology and the good practice. But actually, the adopting the title CLIL doesn't change anything, does it? It's just renaming what they've already been doing. And that does let CLIL open to the criticism that it does get, that it's nothing new, that we've been doing this for centuries. And I disagree, because what CLIL is suggesting is a methodology that analyzes discourse, describes what that language is, and then suggests materials and task design based on that analysis.
Yes, I agree that the word integrated is the answer to the question, is it the same as immersion or not? Because integrated means that, both language and content has to progress, and there is no progress if there is no linguistic meta talk, even at a very simple level. The incidental learning doesn't happen always, and normally in a monolingual context doesn't happen at all if you don't have a meta talk in the class. Of course, I'm not speaking of meta talk, linguistic meta talk at high level, but I think that is the difference, and I think this is the point. I think this is the point, that also language learning has to become aware during a CLIL lesson.
I do agree. I think that's one of the problems that a lot of mother tongue teachers actually disregard. They do not think enough about the kind of language they're using in the classroom and whether their pupils can deal with that language or not, even though it is their mother tongue. Coming back to John's example, I personally think it depends how that teacher dealt with the visual. You can deal with visuals in a way that the visual itself is very helpful in supporting the kind of language that the teacher is using. And in that respect, I personally think you don't need to go up to the meta level in order to deal with language.
Okay. Yeah.
But providing that the pupils have got enough visual support for what the teacher is trying to teach, it's not only content, it also deals with language. But I mean, that's highly theoretical, I know. It probably depends on the kind of example that, or the kind of visual that the teacher used in your example.
Yeah, yeah.